My name is Kelsey. I'm 29 years old, and a few weeks ago, my father accidentally sent me the kind of video that ruins any doubt about where you really stand in your own family. I had only just walked through the door after a long shift, my scrubs still clinging to me, shoes kicked off near the entryway. The apartment was quiet in that late-night way that usually felt comforting. My phone buzzed against the counter, lighting up the room, and I glanced at it without much thought. A message from my dad. Just a video attachment, nothing else. It didn't raise any alarms. He had a habit of sending random clips, old recordings, things he thought were amusing or sentimental, small gestures that made it seem like distance hadn't really changed anything. I tapped the screen casually, already turning toward the sink, expecting background noise or something forgettable. The image jolted into focus like the phone had been set down in a hurry. I saw part of the living room I knew too well, the arm of the couch, the edge of the coffee table. Shapes of people gathered close together, half out of frame. Their faces weren't fully visible, but the room itself was unmistakable. Then I heard laughter, loose and unguarded, and my attention snapped back to the screen. My name came up first, tossed out like a punchline. Someone laughed harder. Then my father spoke, his voice relaxed, almost cheerful, nothing like the clipped tone he used when talking to me. He called me a pathetic failure, said it plainly, comfortably. Another voice jumped in, mocking, saying I should be thankful I was useful for something, that at least I was good for paying everyone's bills. They weren't hiding. There was no hesitation, no slurred speech, no sense of embarrassment. They sounded settled, entertained, at ease with the idea that for years I had been sending money month after month, covering rent, utilities, emergencies, whatever hole needed filling at the time. And in their version of reality, that loyalty made me small. I stood frozen near the counter, my keys still clenched in my hand, watching the screen while they talked openly about how they could pressure me if I ever tried to stop. They listed tactics like they were discussing weather, confident I would never hear it. Just as my father leaned closer to the camera, his face finally coming into focus, the video ended. A notification replaced it. This message has been unsent. The chat cleared itself, blank and clean, as if nothing had ever existed there at all. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I set the phone down carefully, like it might shatter if I moved too fast, and stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. The decision formed quietly, without drama. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to cry or demand explanations. I was going to wait, because in a few days, another payment was due, and that was when the truth would finally have room to breathe. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. By morning, the familiar weight from home had already settled back into place, pressing in the way it always did. It was unsettling how fast my mind slipped into old routines, dates, amounts, deadlines, the quiet dread of another cycle repeating itself. For years, I had treated these moments like fixed obligations, as normal and unavoidable as work schedules. It never began with polite requests. It began with need that never fully resolved. Late rent, overdue bills, doctor visits, car trouble. Each problem delivered with the same unspoken certainty that I would handle it. When I was younger, I told myself this was what dependable people did. When I moved to Oregon and started my job, the distance didn't slow anything down, it magnified it. The expenses multiplied. Somehow their emergencies always took priority over my stability. As the deadline approached, my mom, Denise, reached out, just as expected. She always started gently, a soft greeting, a few lines meant to sound caring, but the warmth never lasted. It faded quickly into reminders, then pressure, then pointed messages that left no doubt she expected the same outcome as always. My dad, Mark, stayed mostly silent, but that silence carried its own demand. It meant he assumed things were being taken care of without needing to involve himself. I had learned that his approval lived somewhere between speed and compliance. My younger sister, Sierra, was more direct. Her messages came fast and sharp, full of urgency, laced with entitlement. Gratitude, if it came at all, always arrived last. This time, every message landed differently, not because they were harsher, but because I finally understood what sat beneath them. I replayed that video in my mind more than once, not the insults themselves, but the ease behind them, the certainty, the assumption that I would always fall back into place. And still, my instincts fought against the truth. Part of me immediately began adjusting numbers in my head, searching for solutions, trying to figure out how to make it work. That realization shook me. The habit was deep. My life had been shaped around their needs for so long that separating myself from them felt like pulling something tight loose inside my chest. The knot eased when I admitted something I had avoided for years. I couldn't keep doing this, not financially, not emotionally, not while pretending their expectations were love. The clarity didn't make the next step easy, but it made it unavoidable. When I finally typed my response, my fingers hesitated over the screen. The message was short, stripped of reassurance, nothing like the explanations I usually offered. There was no apology, no promise to fix it later, just the truth stated plainly. I sent it and set the phone down. The quiet afterward wasn't peaceful, but it was steady. For the first time in years, I didn't rehearse their reactions in my head. The decision belonged to me. Later that week, another notification appeared, heavier than the rest. It wasn't from my mom or Sierra. It was a voice message from my dad's sister, Valerie. She rarely contacted me unless she was stepping in to manage a situation. Seeing her name told me everything had already been discussed without me. I didn't open it right away. I stared at the waveform, the small blue bar waiting. Valerie had always played the role of mediator, wrapping control in kindness, claiming neutrality while guiding outcomes that benefited the family. If she was involved, it meant they were worried. When I finally pressed play, her voice filled the room. Warm at first, carefully measured. She spoke about concern, about confusion surrounding expenses, framing my boundary like a misunderstanding. Her tone was designed to nudge me back into place. As she continued, the warmth cooled. Empathy shifted into disappointment, then subtle judgment. She talked about sacrifices, about family history, editing out the years I worked through school, the independence I fought for long before I left. Then came the warning, delivered softly but clearly. Families, she said, survive by leaning on each other. Stepping away now would show everyone what kind of person I was becoming. The message was unmistakable. If I stopped, I was the problem. Loyalty, in her world, meant endurance, especially mine. She ended by cautioning that once lines like this were crossed, forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. When the message ended, the silence felt dense. I didn't reply it. I didn't respond. I muted the thread and removed it from my screen. It was the quietest refusal I had ever made, and it steadied me. The pressure that usually settled into my chest stayed outside this time, distant, manageable. Saying no had shifted something fundamental. I knew this wouldn't be the last attempt. Boundaries are rarely respected on the first try, but whatever came next would meet a version of me they had never truly faced. By the time the weekend arrived, the air around me felt different, heavy in a way I couldn't name. The apartment was too quiet, every sound echoing. I didn't expect anyone to show up. My family never traveled this far without a reason. That's why the knock startled me. When I opened the door, my younger sister, Sierra, stood on the porch, soaked from Oregon's relentless rain, her expression sharp with purpose. Seeing her there pulled something tight inside my chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Sierra never confronted a problem directly unless she believed she had the upper hand. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past me with the confidence of someone who assumed entry was her right, dripping water onto the hardwood floor as she moved into the living room. The air around her felt charged, like she carried the storm inside with her. I closed the door slowly, leaving a small buffer of space between us while she surveyed the room, as if searching for a secret life I'd been keeping. It was strange watching her absorb the quiet order of my home. For years, she'd compared herself to me, sometimes resentfully, sometimes with a kind of admiration she refused to name. But today, her focus held no admiration at all. The silence stretched until it became impossible to ignore. Sierra finally spoke, her voice tight, controlled, shaped by frustration. She said she didn't understand what I was doing, that I had thrown the entire household into chaos. She paced as she spoke, moving in sharp lines like she was trying to outrun the reality settling over her. Even without direct accusations, the implication was clear. She believed my hesitation was an act of betrayal. While she moved, I watched the tension gather in her shoulders. I noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands kept flexing as if bracing for impact. For a moment, I wondered if she had come to me for comfort, if she had arrived seeking the sister who used to take care of everything. But whatever softness existed in her was buried beneath a thick layer of entitlement. As she continued, her tone shifted into something sharper. Each sentence hinted at the same belief that I owed them stability, that my refusal to cover the upcoming expenses was reckless, selfish, dangerous. I let her speak without interruption, not out of guilt, but because I needed to hear the shape of her reasoning. She didn't mention the video, she didn't acknowledge what I had heard or how it might have affected me. It was as if my feelings didn't exist, as if the only reality worth considering was the one that pivoted around their expectations. It became clear that she hadn't come to understand, she had come to correct me. The weight of that realization settled over me slowly, not painful but clarifying. Sierra wasn't acting out of desperation, she was acting out of certainty. Certainty that I would bend, certainty that I would resume my role, certainty that the person who had always stepped in would step in again. But something in me had already shifted, and watching her now only made that shift more definite. Her presence didn't pull me backward, it drew a boundary I hadn't known how to articulate until this moment. I finally spoke, not loudly, not defensively, but with a calm that surprised even me. I told her I had made my decision, that there was nothing more to discuss, and that I needed her to leave. The words didn't rise or tremble, they simply existed, firm and final, like a door clicking shut. For a heartbeat, Sierra froze. She searched my face for a crack, a hint of hesitation she could pry open, but I had none to offer. She turned away sharply, the storm inside her flashing across every movement as she headed for the door. When it closed behind her, the silence that followed felt different from the one before. It wasn't empty, it was steady, grounded, a quiet that belonged to me. Early the next evening, a different kind of tension settled over my apartment, the kind that comes from knowing something is approaching even before it arrives. I barely finished making dinner when my phone lit up with a call from my dad, Mark, his name glowing on the screen like a warning. He rarely called me directly unless he expected an immediate response. Letting it ring felt strangely empowering, but eventually I answered, not out of obligation, but to hear the version of the story he would try to sell. His tone came out sharp, clipped, controlled in the way he used when he wanted his words to land without question. He asked what was going on, why I was suddenly making things complicated, why I couldn't just handle this the way I always had. The phrasing wasn't new, but the expectation beneath it felt heavier now. He didn't mention he was out, whether something had changed. He only focused on the disruption my decision had caused. While he spoke, I could hear the faint sound of movement behind him, the restless pacing that always accompanied tension in the household. It struck me that he wasn't calling to understand, he was calling to restore order, his order. Every part of his voice suggested he believed my refusal was temporary, something he could correct with authority rather than conversation. When he finished, I didn't offer explanations, I didn't soften anything. I simply told him I wasn't sending the payment. The silence that followed lasted just long enough for me to feel the boundaries settle between us. Then he exhaled long and irritated, as if my answer confirmed a suspicion he already held, that I wasn't fulfilling the role he expected of me. He hung up without waiting for anything more. Not long after, my mom, Denise, tried. Her voice carried a different strategy, quivering edges, a breath that suggested tears, the familiar rhythm she used whenever she wanted to disarm me. She spoke about stress, about the instability at home, about how hard things had been lately. She didn't mention the video or how it might have affected me. She spoke only of consequences, not causes. Listening to her felt like sinking underwater. For years, that tone had wrapped itself around my decisions, pushing me toward choices that preserved her comfort over my well-being. But this time, something inside me remained anchored. I didn't slip. I didn't apologize. I let her words pass through me without catching on anything. After she ended the call, the quiet left in its place felt strangely solid. A different kind of task waited, one that I had been preparing for ever since I decided I was done carrying the weight of their household. I opened my laptop and pulled up the information from Mr. Collins, the landlord who managed the property my parents lived in. I had arranged payments through him for years, handling it all without the household needing to speak to him directly. Ending that arrangement felt like reclaiming a part of my adulthood I hadn't realized I'd handed away. When he answered, his tone was brisk and professional. I kept my explanation simple. I told him I would no longer be responsible for the rental payments and that future billing needed to go directly to the tenants. There was no hesitation on his end, only a brief confirmation and a note about updating the account. Real-world consequences rarely carried emotion. They just existed. In some ways, that clarity was more grounding than anything else I'd felt in weeks. After the call, I logged into my bank and canceled every automatic transfer tied to their expenses. Watching each deletion felt like removing a weight I had mistaken for part of my spine. My phone buzzed once more that night. A single message from my dad. Short. Final. A declaration that if anything fell apart now, the blame would rest entirely on me. I didn't reply. The stillness that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest, and honesty, for the first time, felt like freedom. A few quiet weeks passed before the consequences began to echo back toward me in unmistakable ways. It started with a voicemail from Mr. Collins, the landlord, his tone as steady as ever but edged with a formality that hinted at new complications. When I returned his call, he informed me that the tenants were already behind on the first payment they were expected to handle themselves. He mentioned late fees, efforts to reach them, and the growing urgency of resolving the balance. Nothing in his voice was emotional, it was simply procedural, a straightforward update on a situation he assumed I needed to be aware of. But I didn't. Not anymore. Ending the arrangement had placed every responsibility back where it belonged. Hearing the update didn't stir guilt the way it once would have. Instead, it settled over me like a reminder of how disproportionate my role in their lives had been. I thanked him, confirmed that all future concerns should be addressed directly to the tenants, and ended the call. Later that week, a message from an old neighbor of my parents arrived unexpectedly. She wasn't someone I kept in touch with, just a familiar name tied to childhood memories of summer evenings and borrowed tools. Her note was brief, mentioning tension in the household, voices raised often enough to carry across the yard. She didn't ask me to intervene, she simply assumed I already knew. The assumption stung more than the content of the message itself. It revealed how visible my involvement had been from the outside, how my financial support had become common knowledge in a way I never intended. Not long after, more pieces of information drifted toward me from different corners. Someone mentioned seeing my dad, Mark, leaving a labor office early one morning, dressed in work clothes he hadn't touched in years. Another person hinted that my mom, Denise, had been reaching out to relatives for small loans, her tone alternating between embarrassment and urgency. And my younger sister, Sierra, whose certainty had once filled every conversation, was suddenly posting online about selling her car, hinting at temporary setbacks without ever naming the source. None of these updates came directly from them. They arrived like loose threads carry on a wind I wasn't part of anymore. And for the first time, the distance didn't feel cold. It felt earned. In the space that opened up, I started noticing how much of my life had been shaped around their needs, how many decisions I'd forced into narrow corners to accommodate the next invoice, the next emergency, the next excuse. Without those demands, my days expanded in subtle ways. I cooked more often. I took longer walks after work. I didn't rush through evenings trying to anticipate what might fall apart next. Financially, the shift was even clearer. Money that used to vanish the moment it entered my account now stayed long enough for me to plan beyond a single month. I paid down debts faster. I began a small savings fund I had tried to start for years but never managed to grow. The relief wasn't dramatic. It was steady, measured, like air returning slowly to a room that had been closed off too long. Of course, a part of me wondered how they were processing the change, not with longing, not with regret, just with curiosity about what it meant for them to face the responsibilities they had handed to me so casually. I didn't wish hardship on them. I wished clarity. I wished accountability. And whether they wanted it or not, both had arrived. By the end of the month, the noise from their world became little more than background static, distant, faint, and no longer tied to me. For years, I had been the buffer between their problems and the real consequences waiting behind them. Without me there, the consequences had finally stepped forward, and I was learning what my life looked like without carrying anyone else's weight. By the time the month drew to a close, the distance between my life and theirs had widened into something solid and unmistakable. I wasn't checking for updates anymore, yet they still found ways to reach me indirectly, like signals from a world I no longer lived in. One of those signals arrived through an unfamiliar number late one night, a notification with a single video attachment. Curiosity nudged me more than concern, so I opened it. The footage was shaky, as if someone had recorded it while pretending not to. It showed the living room of my parents' house, lit by a single overhead lamp that cast uneven shadows across the floor. My dad, Mark, stood in the center, his posture tense, pacing in clipped lines. My mom, Denise, sat on the couch, wringing her hands with an agitation that made her look older than I remembered. Sierra hovered near the hallway, arms crossed, her expression tight with frustration. They weren't talking about me, they were talking about each other. Accusations flew in fragmented bursts. My dad blamed my mom for not budgeting. My mom blamed Sierra for not working more hours. Sierra insisted none of this would have happened if someone else had stepped in the way I used to. Every voice collided with another, forming a kind of chaos I once had been tasked with holding together. Now, without anyone to absorb the tension, it spiraled out into the open. No one mentioned the video I'd received weeks earlier. No one mentioned the names they had called me. They only spoke about the imbalance left behind, the space where my support used to be. Watching them unravel didn't bring satisfaction, it brought clarity. They weren't suffering because I stepped away, they were suffering because they had never learned to stand without leaning on someone else. When the video ended, I felt the weight of a decision I'd postponed long enough. It was time to draw the final line. I sat at my desk, opened a blank email, and began typing, not out of anger, but out of the need to close a chapter cleanly. I explained that I had seen enough to understand the dynamic that shaped our lives for years. I didn't list what I paid, I didn't recount what they said, I didn't ask for accountability. Instead, I wrote that I was stepping out of the role I had been assigned without consent, that I no longer intended to be a buffer between them and the consequences of their choices. I told them not to contact me again unless it was for something meaningful, something human, something that didn't involve money, guilt, or expectation. When I pressed send, the finality felt steady, not sharp. Blocking their numbers afterwards felt like protection, something I should have allowed myself years ago. The quiet that followed wasn't empty or lonely. It was spacious, like a room I could finally breathe in. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything I had walked through. I realized how easy it is to confuse obligation with love, how easily guilt can impersonate loyalty, and how silently resentment grows when you give more than you have. The truth was simple. Stepping away didn't make me heartless. It made me honest, and honesty, I learned, is a form of freedom. If my story offers anything to someone else, I hope it's this. You are allowed to leave places where you are only valued for what you provide. You are allowed to choose peace over performance. You are allowed to protect a version of yourself no one else ever bothered to see. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. Before you go, tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most and why.